The conservatism of the Reagan era was divided into three camps. And each of the camps had intellectual advocates, they had activist movements, but they all came together like three different currents of a river flowing into a single large current that we call Reaganism. And I mentioned earlier that Reaganism preceded Reagan. And what I mean is really that the ideas of Reagan came before Reagan. Reagan didn't come up with them. He didn't manufacture them, if you will. He just came along and he goes, I like this, I like that, I like this. And he pulled these ideas together into a coherent philosophy. But the philosophy in its parts was much less coherent. And I think each part examined by itself was very promising on the one hand, but also kind of problematic. So let's look at this. The first group were the libertarians. And the libertarians were just fantastic in being able to describe why free markets are better than centralized control. I said Hayek was their chief expositor, but there were many others, brilliant writers, George Gilder and others, who were just talk about ways that markets work that centralized government can't. I remember in one of Hayek's essays, he talks about the fact, and this is my example, not his, but he says in effect, let's take a street intersection in New York, 56th and 3rd. And Hayek says, what's happening right now as we speak at that intersection? And he goes, nobody knows. Centralized government doesn't know. However much inputs you put into a computer, you then ask them, what's happening at 56th and 3rd? Or go to a different city. Well, what's happening on Michigan Avenue and 37th? And Hayek goes, the only people who know are the people who are on the scene. Not just the people who live there, but let's just say there's a street vendor. This is a guy who has a hot dog stand at that intersection. Well, he happens to know, well, yeah, there was an accident here a couple of hours ago. And oh, that's very crowded today. So Hayek's point is that decisions are best made at the decentralized level by the people who are in the best position to know what's really going on. And this idea that a centralized government can coordinate for all these different states, for large states and small, for cities and rural areas, for places as far distant as Alaska, and then on the other end, Florida. He goes, this is nonsensical. This is human hubris. And so Hayek identified the arrogance at the heart of modern progressivism. But there was a downside to these libertarians, and the downside was, in the end, they trusted the market so much that even if our jobs were being sent abroad, even if this was hollowing out our middle class, even if this was decimating small towns and even small cities, because cities based on you had entire cities based on single industries. Pittsburgh, for example, was based on steel. Detroit was based on cars. And so what happens is once the car industry moves to Japan and moves elsewhere, and people can make cars cheaper or they can make steel cheaper, on the one hand, yeah, that's good for consumers because they can pay less and get a really good car, a Japanese car perhaps, or a German car. But on the other hand, what happens to all those people? What happens to the whole infrastructure, to the community, to the civic culture around those cities and towns? And the answer is, it's not a pretty sight. And the libertarians really were blind to this, in my opinion. And this is something where Trump comes in and he says, wait a minute, these trade deals that we make, and this kind of system of international free trade, it's not without benefits. And if you look at the world as a market, then sure, there are benefits to the world to have a free market. But we are also Americans. We live in one part of the world called America. America is, if you will, our home and our team. And we want America to be successful and America to be prosperous. So shouldn't we look at American interests no less than sort of global welfare? So all of this would come later. But this is not something that the libertarians, and I must say myself, influenced by libertarianism, not sufficiently alert and sensitive to this point, going back to the Reagan years. Then you had the neocons, and the neocons were anti-communist, and they rightly identified the threat posed by Soviet Russia. They were extremely effective in polemically arguing against it, but also building strong policies. Many of these neocons, Richard Pipes was the Sovietologist. Richard Pearl ended up in the nuclear weapons department of the State Department. And so these are guys who not only thought ideas, but they actually served in high positions in government, and they deserve a measure of credit for the fall of the Soviet Empire. Obviously, the primary credit goes, I think, to Reagan. Gorbachev deserves some credit. Margaret Thatcher does, Lech Walesa, the Pope, John Paul II. But the neocons played an important part. The problem with the neocons is that they continued in the same militaristic frame of mind. They continue to be very anti-Russia today, even though Russia is no longer communist. They act as though it is. They're always looking for the new sort of Soviet Union. This is part of why they have this kind of aggression toward Putin. They've become champions of, you could call them, forever wars. They've lost the distinction, which, by the way, Reagan had, and I'll talk about this in the next segment. Reagan was pragmatic about the use of force in the way that the neocons aren't.